and welcome to the second of our Edinburgh Fringe Preview podcasts. In a moment, you'll hear me talking about the shows Glasschild and Sanctuary. But first, I spoke to writer and performer Cara Wilson about her show, Helen Bradley. And I'm now joined by Cara Wilson to talk about the show Helen Bradley, painter and storyteller. Hello, Cara.
Hello, nice to meet you.
And you are the writer and performer behind Helen Bradley. Tell us all about the show.
Well, it's a kind of unique genre of a one-woman show because I can paint. That's why I started writing shows about painters, because I thought, what fun to do a painting at the same time as telling the artist's story. So I started way back in the 1998 with my first one, a Scottish painter, Bessie McNichol.
Right.
And it worked so well. I've been doing them ever since. And when I turned 80, 2 years ago, I thought I'll do one at the Fringe every year. Why not? So I brought out Beryl Cook first time. And then last year I did an old one about Vanessa Bell. And this year's a brand new one about Helen Bradley that I know about because I'm so old. But a lot of people don't know about her. She died in 1979. And I know about it because she brought her beautiful books in the early 70s. The most famous one was called And Miss Carter Wore Pink.
Okay.
And I bought that for my daughter. And so I did remember her. But I had forgotten her until I went to somebody's house last November and that book fell out the library. And I thought, terrific.
So tell us a bit more about Helen. What's the story? Because it sounds like a fascinating one.
Well, she's Lancashire, but she's a granny. And that's what excited me too. Now I'm so old, I can't play a young one. So, I mean, the artist has to live to a good age for me to get to play it. So she didn't start painting until she was 65. She was very talented, but she spent her time, as many people did, bringing out husband, home, and children.
Yes.
And that was her life for 40 years until she suddenly broke free and thought, I can't keep on doing housework. So she started to paint, and she painted. I've got these paintings behind me on the style. This is one that I did earlier, just to show the audience her normal style, which is full of many, many people, all looking sideways, you know, but very colourful and absolutely telling her childhood in near Oldham. And she was born in 1900. Wow. So I set the play in 1978. So she's 78 years old and she's having a whale of a time. She gets such success, mostly from her books, because they tell the world and they go all over the world and they're translated, reprinted. So she's very big in America and Australia and Japan. They love her in Japan. So she gets success.
So just so people are clear, just so I'm clear, the books and the paintings, were the books fiction?
The books were about her, the stories that went with the paintings. She never titled the painting. She just wrote a little story and she pasted it on the back of the canvas saying, this is what's happening here. This is us all meeting at Mumps Station to go to Blackpool. Or this is us going for a walk. This is the painting I do in the show, so we'll hide it. And she wrote these stories, and Jonathan Cape got very excited about the stories and said, well, let's bring out picture books. So there were the painting and underneath the story. So it was there were so many characters and we knew who they all were. There was grandma and the aunts and mother, and she herself was in every picture as a sort of 5-year-old. And that's just wonderful for a child to sit and hear the story. And just what excited me going back, thinking about writing it, was just what life was like in 1900 when you were born in a village outside Oldham, where the air was more yellow than blue. The sky was yellow. But you were safe to run across the street because there was only an occasional horse and cart coming along.
Yeah, absolutely. Different times, absolutely. Before we go any further, we should let people know where and when they can see the show.
Yes, it's on from the 5th to the 30th of August at the Pleasance Courtyard in the cellar, which is where I was last year, which is just perfect. It's, a tiny little 50-seater. It's not that tiny, but everybody's facing and well ranked so you can see the painting, because it's important that people see the painting.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what audiences can expect, because it's an interesting proposition for a show to watch someone painting.
And it's finished by the end. Yes, I have the drawing on the canvas, I have to confess, because you'd be mad not to have the drawing on the canvas. And funnily enough, people keep asking me, do you do a different painting every day? I think, are you mad? No, I do the same painting every day. I've got it timed, because you have to be in and out at the festival in an hour.
Yeah, of course.
And so they come in and it's not there. By the time they leave, it is there. And it tells the story of her childhood and her mother and her aunts.
Just as an aside, what happens to the paintings?
Well, the joy of the Beryl Cooks, which I wrote with Beryl Cook's son, was he allowed me to sell them every day at the end. But poor Helen Bradley suffered a lot from having fakes made,
Okay.
So she hated that. You can hear her desert island discs. And when they ask her, what book would you like to take on the island? Right at the end, she says, I'd like to take a book about copyright law.
Wow.
So it was really hurting her, even then, that people were, well, it's not that easy to copy, because
No.
I have tried. I mean, I did my best with this one because I wanted it on the stage just to show what kind of painting she did. And I was filled with admiration for her when I tried to copy the background, which mine is rubbish, but hers was beautiful. Turner was her inspiration, and she used her hand to make the skies and mix the colors. She was quite unorthodox, but I think she was supremely talented. But people did copy her. So I have asked the family, could I sell them at the end? Because I will sign them in my name and write on the back that this was a poor copy done on the something of August. And they said, no, they still didn't like copies going out. So they're sensitive about it to this. So I have sold other ones, I sold Bessie McNichols, I sold Tamara de Lempicka. There's some of them hanging throughout the country.
I mean, you said at the beginning of our chat that it's a kind of rare concept of painter plays. Is it really just a singular concept? Is it just your concept? Is anyone else doing something like this?
I don't know anyone else.
No.
Occasionally I've heard of artists who will paint in front of people, but artists don't like that normally. How it came about was when the Leith Gallery opened in 1997, it was a friend who was opening it. Some of my paintings were going to be there. And she said, why don't you come and paint in the gallery? The smell of the paint, it'll just make it exciting. New gallery, new opening, paint. So I said, I'd love to. And it was the Edinburgh Festival. And every day I invited a friend and I'd sit and I'd paint. And that's when I found out that I was more of an actress than a painter, because I painted better when people were looking at me. I think those are the best paintings I ever did. Those ones there, portraits of friends. So and it was the Leith Gallery that said, let's put on a show of you doing a painting. And so I came up with the idea, Glasgow Girl, about Bessie McNichol. A beautiful book had just come out of all the Glasgow girls. Lots to choose from. Absolutely beautiful. So I did Bessie McNichol. And I don't know anyone else doing it. But I mean, I've written 6 now, and I want them published so that someday when some actress who paints wants to do them, they're there.
And have they developed over the years, or did you pretty much have the idea down from the start?
I think they're more or less the same. I have to get a different conceit for each one. Tamara de Lempicka was a great showy Art Deco Polish painter, very full of herself. Hers was an interview that she was supposed to give, but she was late and she was fed up with them and she didn't want to speak to them. And so just sit there, don't ask me questions, let me paint, that sort of thing. And then the one about Vanessa Bell was a conversation to herself, to her dead sister, all alone. That was last year. That was fairly somber. So I'm delighted to do Helen Bradley, who is at an art club speaking to the audience because they have come to the art club. And that's the sort of thing she did. She got very social in her latter years and she loved to go and talk to people. So this is a wonderful opportunity. So they all have to get the painting done in an hour. So a lot of it, my back is turned to the audience.
Yeah.
Which, you know, my worst review was, it's like watching paint dry. Some of my best reviews were, it's a show to take your granny to. And this one certainly is.
I think that line, it's like watching paint dry, that sounds like a reviewer who already had that before they went into the show.
Had it, yes.
But this story of Helen, just from the little I've looked into, I mean, what a fascinating one. I think not just that you're coming to painting later in life, but the success. That's, you know, people would find that almost impossible to believe.
Money, yes. And, you know, one went in the Edinburgh Art Gallery not long ago for £167,000, you know, long after she's dead. Yes, suddenly.
Yeah,
Them
fabulous.
all by surprise. So exciting.
And did she get to enjoy that in terms of travel and being in front of people who wanted to talk about it?
Not at all, really.
Oh, right.
She just got an MBE when she was 78 and she died in 79 before she went to get it. She was a bit nervous about going to get it because she thought, don't you have to kneel down? You know, don't you have to go up steps to meet the Queen and then you have to kneel down? Then worse still, you got to get up and you can't hold on to a skirt to get up. So she never went for it.
And in terms of the acting side of things, inhabiting the character, which you clearly do, I mean, how do you get into that? Is it, or does it just come quite naturally?
Well, the good thing was when you're writing about a real person, you've got to find out if there's any family.
Yes.
So you have to meet the family and get their permission. So that was a search because I went through all the galleries that said they knew all about him. They didn't know members of the family. And I phoned up lawyers and then I went to the books and the books are out of print, sadly. You can still get the odd secondhand one. And then I went on to ancestry.com and I found the family tree. And that made me able to connect with the granddaughter. So then I was able to meet her. And she, she's from the same area. She's never left. And thankfully, she was delighted at the thought of doing it. So, I mean, I'm obviously not exactly like her grandmother. There are films of her.
Right.
So, I mean, I can copy her voice from, Desert Island Discs. And there's a very nice little film, if you Google her, that you can get that the BBC did of several artists. So I've seen her move, walk and talk. And that's how you get into it.
Yeah. And do the subject have to kind of almost come to you? You said that, it was the rediscovery of a book that kind of went, oh, that sparked the interest. Is that the way it often works? Is that the person or the painter comes to you?
Yes. I mean, I search all the time for women artists of a certain age. I'd love to do Joan Erdley, but she died in her 40s, you know. The very first one I did, I think I was 54 and she died in childbirth at 34. So that was pushing it even then. But I am on the lookout all the time. But when they come to me, like that one just suddenly came in the right month of the year for me to get it written, get it researched and get it on. So they come to me.
Now, you said that you've been at the Fringe a number of times. And I was wondering what you most enjoy about Edinburgh during the Fringe.
Well, I love Edinburgh. I was born in Glasgow, but my parents moved to Edinburgh when I was at university. When I was 20, my father's job was in Edinburgh and he got fed up commuting, so they moved to Colinton.
Right.
And so that became home where you went with your washing,
Yes.
And throughout, even when I got married to Tom and moved to England, Edinburgh was where we came home and felt like home because they were there. And for the last 20 years, I've got grandchildren now. The oldest is 22. But for those 20 years, 22 years really, I've been going to the Edinburgh Festival with my daughter, Nina,
right,
as Granny. So, I mean, that Edinburgh has become, it always felt like coming home, but the Edinburgh Festival, Edinburgh, is even more exciting. And we stay in the same flat, so it's really like coming home. And the whole family's there. Nina's usually performing, doing her ventriloquism.
Yes.
And the grandsons needed looking after. Now they don't need.
Yeah, not so much if they're 20 odd.
that one's 22, one's 15.
Right.
And that is when I started to go back and thought, oh, I think time to do something myself. That job's over. I'm a bit like Helen Bradley. I enjoyed that job.
Yes.
Very much. I used to say the last 20 years of my life were my happiest, because to get two boys was just wonderful. Two little boys to look after. And Nina she was on the rise and very, very busy. So she needed help. That was a wonderful period. Over, move on. So I have moved on to pushing myself more and enjoying.
Have you seen the Fringe change over the years, that yourself and even Nina's has been there for many years? So have you seen it change?
I have seen it change. I went in 1965 from Glasgow University, and there were 12 shows on the Fringe. 12.
That's incredible, isn't it? That is incredible.
A tiny little program, and it was mostly the universities sending up their drama groups. So our guds, we went there with a play, and it was exciting, but there was very little competition. And so now I have seen it every year, more and more and more. But I just love it, because what do I like best about it? The audience. The audience is so game. Everyone on the street is excited. They're going to a show. They've been at a show. You can talk to anyone, say, what's good? Where have you been? They fill their days with going to shows. You don't get that anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's incredible to think back when you first went that you could absolutely go and see every show twice if you wanted to, if there was only 12 of them.
You could. And now you've no idea. You have to ask people because the program is.
Yeah, it's astonishing. It really is. It really is. Is there anything you're particularly looking forward to this year?
Staying in the same lovely flat south of the Meadows. Always like that. And the whole family will be there again. You know, Nina is on again for the middle week, and the boys are just locked into coming to Edinburgh. One likes to go up Arthur's Seat all the time, and the other one goes to every show. He does 8 shows a day. Oh, wow. The older one is now a professional actor himself and doing very well. So my dream is to write a show for the boys. How
fabulous would that be? We should say, for people listening who don't know, that the Nina we're referring to is Nina Conti, one of the fantastic ventriloquists and comedians as well.
I know. Well, who would have known that was going to happen?
Yeah, exactly.
You couldn't have told that shy little girl at school would stand out in front of 1,000 people and not know what she's going to say.
Yeah. That's the trick. Perhaps, not knowing what you're going to say so you get someone else to say it.
I know. She just lets her monkey speak.
It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Can we let people know again when and where they can see you?
Yes, they have to get up early because I'm on in the morning. I'm on at 11:20, so that's why I need that dedicated Edinburgh audience that want to fill their whole day. So, I mean, I'll be going home for a nap when the rest of the family is just getting up. 11:20, cellar, Pleasance Courtyard, every day from the 5th, when the festival begins, to the 30th. And the only night I'm not doing it is the 19th, one night off.
Wow, well done.
One morning off. Let's look at it.
A morning show, there'll be plenty of people not knowing what to see in the morning. They're kind of like, oh, no, don't know about knowing. So there's the perfect show to come and see. Absolutely. It sounds amazing. Kayah, thanks again for taking the time to talk to me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
I'm delighted now to be joined by Kayah and Maitreyah Gunther. Hello, both.
Hello. Hello.
And we're here to talk about your show, Glass Child, which is going to be on at the Fringe. Now, I don't know who wants to answer this one first, but can you tell us about Glass Child?
Yeah, well, Glass Child is a autobiography work. So it's a show about both our lives together, growing up, all the positives, the negatives, and all the things that we have faced alone and together, and the journey through society. Um, and what would you say Glass Child is about?
Because because child I think like a friendship. Yeah,
A friendship.
yeah,
It's about our friendship.
yeah,
That's a good
yeah,
answer. That's a very
Yeah,
nice answer.
it's a lovely
yeah.
answer, actually, Kaya. And of course, we haven't even mentioned that you are siblings.
Yes,
Yeah, yes.
yes.
So, not everyone's it's a strong friendship with their sibling, but that's a
Uh,
lovely to say. So that relationship is absolutely central to the piece.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's a very I'm very yeah, it's so I think we know each other so well and deeply, and I think because we've been dancing together for so long, haven't we?
oh,
So I
yes.
think it's easy. It's very easy to be on stage with Kaya because he's like my other half, I guess.
And have you been putting this show on, putting Glass Child on for a while? Has this been played elsewhere? Has this been shown elsewhere?
Yeah, we've done a few seasons of it. So we've done some seasons. So we live on the Gold Coast, Australia, and we've had two seasons on the Gold Coast, but then also we had a season in Brisbane, which is not too far from Gold Coast.
Hmm.
And then we had our national tour last year of it, which was really, really fun. We did Western Australia and Sydney. And we had such a wonderful, wonderful time. But obviously, it took some time to develop it and work on it. But yeah, so we've done it many, many times, but it always feels pretty fresh, which I think is good.
And is this your first time at the Edinburgh Fringe?
Yes, yes. And having this show international, so we're very excited, aren't we, Kaya?
Oh,
Because
yes.
we had hoped it would be able to go overseas, but obviously with dance theatre, you never know because obviously everything has its lifespan. So, we wasn't sure whether the last tour was the last or and then we got the invitation and we were really, really excited. We're so excited.
Yeah. Edinburgh in August is quite a exciting place to be, definitely.
Mm.
We should let people know before we go any further when and where they can see you.
So it will be at the Summer Hall Theatre or building,
Mhm.
and it is from the 6th to the 16th of August. And I believe it's at 1:30 p.m. every day.
Oh, good, because people are always looking for a good afternoon show, so that's
Yeah.
a good one to do. And Summer Hall's a fantastic venue. I mean, it's so much going on there. It's a real hub of the Fringe every year, so
Yeah.
you'll have a great time there. And what can audiences expect? What will they get when they walk through the door?
I think, what do you think the audience will expect? Probably a
Mm,
few surprises.
yes.
I think it's quite a journey of a show. Like I would say it's often I've had people describe to me it as you laugh, you cry, and you smile. And I think you can sort of expect to have those sort of feelings in it, or I guess hope for them to feel those things. Um, what else do you think people should expect when they come see the show?
Mm. See, see, so, feel, I need, mm, I need to feel, uh, it's hard.
love.
Oh,
They can
Ah,
expect to see some love,
that's
yeah.
lovely. That's lovely.
sibling love.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Kaya, what's it like to perform? Because it's dance, isn't it?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Dance theater. So like,
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
So, or maybe
What's what?
that might be a nice breakdown to talk about dance theatre. So, what does that actually entail? There's a storytelling aspect to it, is there?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So it starts as, I guess, a theatre piece. It sort of begins sort of like a TED Talk sort of setup. So it's very, I guess, you know, how do I describe it? Has a very clear setup, I guess. And then as the show goes on, the show begins with sort of me introducing us and our journeys, but done through storytelling. And then as we sort of go into the piece, as we go deeper into Kaya's world, words begin to disappear. So then the show sort of takes on another journey into the deep, dark, beautiful places, but without words. And it's, yeah, I would say probably only like there's less than half like talking in the show, and then the rest is like no words spoken and lots of dance movement, but lots of slow movements,
Yeah,
fast-paced moments,
yeah,
where we get out into some very like intense sort of jazz hip hop dancing, but then also lots of contemporary components and partner work. So it's quite a mixture of things, I would say.
And how was the show created? When did you decide, I guess, to take your relationship and put it on the stage? Because it's quite a big step to do that.
Yeah, totally. So basically, it's interesting coming to Edinburgh because it started in Edinburgh. So Kai and I, we made a little 20-minute piece for the World Down Syndrome Conference. So we went along, we had this sort of dance piece that we showed. But it was really interesting because, at the World Down Syndrome Conference, there's lots of doctors and teachers and professionals with lots of, their knowledge. And it was interesting because hardly anyone came to our show because they all chose to go to the doctors and, people talking about what it means to have a sibling with a disability when they did not have any lived experience. So it was really interesting. It was a huge hall, but hardly anyone came, did they? And I think we came away and we were sort of a bit inspired, like, okay, I'd like to. And then we basically approached Gavin and Kate, who were already friends of ours.
Right.
And we were like, we'd like to make a show about our life. So it's interesting coming back to Edinburgh because that's where it sort of began.
So that initial time was just a talk rather than any kind of performance.
It was so at the World Down Syndrome Conference, it was
Yeah.
a whole mainly like doctor talks and teachers, you know, for families who have someone with the Down syndrome. But we said we would do a dance piece
Right.
as a sibling duo. But it was interesting. We didn't have many takers, but I guess because people would prefer to go to the professionals, I guess.
Well, I love how that's not only inspired you, but almost, a lot of people would have taken that as a bit of a knockback that, nobody's turned up to see you. And,
Yes.
there's lots of stories like that from Edinburgh when they first started. But
Yeah.
but actually you decided, no, we're going to develop this and change
Yes.
it and adapt the show.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think Kaya had already done some performance, had made a show with our director Gavin, and they toured Chile and it was really, really beautiful. So they had already developed a really beautiful rapport, I think, didn't you?
oh, yeah,
And
yeah.
then I think and then we were like, okay, we want to do a sibling show. And yeah, and I guess then, you go for some grants, a little bit of funding, and then, and then eventually you come up with a show and then yeah, it's interesting how things then fall into place.
Yeah, sure. And the title Glass Child, it might be nice to just give an explanation of where that comes from.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I didn't know this term growing up, but the glass child, it is the word to describe someone of a sibling with a disability and how, in ways, they are, I suppose, looked through to meet the needs of the other that has a disability. But it's interesting as we sort of went further within the show and creating it, you realize that you sort of flip the name because I help Kayah be seen in ways that he wants to, but he also does the same for me, and it's almost becomes like a mirror for one another. So yeah, it was interesting seeing the name take a different meaning as we completed the show.
Yeah, and that sounds really interesting in terms of how you've described the show as well. That
Mm,
that people can take different aspects from not just the show but the title itself.
yes, of course.
And I was wondering, and again, this I don't know who wants to answer this one, but what are the challenges in working with a sibling? Now, I have a brother who I love dearly, absolutely. But there must be challenges in working with your siblings.
Yeah, yes.
Would you say we had some challenges?
Ah, yes.
And what were those challenges?
Um, mm. Ah, challenge is mm. I think I be mm,
Maybe just can I be bossy sometimes?
uh little
A little
bit.
bit, a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah, 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 yes.
I
Uh,
think maybe like in any sibling relationship, you have your fun moments and then you have your moments of, conflict. But I think we worked together pretty well because because you were dealing with sometimes dark, heavy moments. So I think we did try keep the humor and
Uh, I think I try uh for
support
for Salah.
support each other.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
that's lovely to hear, and that's how it should be, absolutely. And in terms of dance, is that something you've always done?
Yeah, so I would say you've been dancing since before he was born. Like he was always,
That's lovely.
my mum always felt him in her belly. And then once, um, yeah, Kaya just was always moving, always dancing. And it's actually really cool. In the show, we have home videos that are shown. I won't give too much away, but it is
Yeah.
like there's, real footage and real memory that's at times you will see within the show. And yeah, so Kai, you were always dancing, weren't you?
Ah, yeah, yeah, yes, yeah.
And I started dancing when I was 11, so I think both of us found a lot of um, comfort and just enjoyed it and still do.
Yeah. And because actually dance theatre is a big part of the Fringe. There's a lot of shows every year,
Yeah.
where that's a kind of central strand of it. There's a lot of shows of every type and everything.
Yes.
Is there anything you're particularly looking forward to coming over to, or is it all new to you?
I think we haven't had this show in a fringe festival, so I think we're just so excited, like, and we're so excited that, House of Oz is bringing us over, like, we're eternally grateful, and just, I think, honestly, just so honored that we get to come over and share our work that's very important to us and to see and to see the other shows. Yeah, I think to be there is just going to be like pretty, yeah, monumental for us. Yeah.
Well, where you're based in Summer Hall, you won't be short of choices for shows because there's lots going on there. So you won't even have to
Okay.
go very far to find some really interesting
Wow.
stuff.
It sounds so amazing, and yeah, we're pretty keen. It's coming up, like it's not far away, so
Not
it's
far away
like
at all.
no.
And In terms of working together, is that something you would do another show together? Have you thought about that, or is it just all about Glass Child just now?
I think, you know, yeah, for sure. Like, I have another show in the future that I want to make with Kaya, and I'm definitely interested in playing with short films and just, yeah, to just keep creating and making art and to try different avenues as well. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I can always see myself working with Kaya because, yeah,
And what
he's
about you,
still stuck
Kaya?
with me.
Do you say the
Oh,
same
yes.
thing? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
Do you agree?
Ah, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yes.
absolutely. Well, it sounds like a fascinating show. It sounds like a lovely show as well. So I hope people will get along to see it. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's been a real pleasure, and all the very best in Edinburgh.
Thank you. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Thank you for having us.
No, it's been lovely to meet you both. And I'm delighted now to be joined by writer Jacob Sparrow to hear all about the show Sanctuary. Hello, Jacob.
Hello, Alistair. Nice to see you.
It's lovely to see you too. And tell us all about Sanctuary.
Yeah, so Sanctuary is going to be on in Edinburgh this year, so at the Pleasance for the whole month of the run. And it's my first play, so it's the first thing that I've written, and it won the Leodis Prize, so it's the first time this prize has happened, which is run by Leodis and Pleasance, which is for unrepresented writers and also just for, I guess for like it's a champions new writing. And I found out that it won maybe like 2 months ago, 6 weeks ago.
Well.
And so since then have just been working on the production. It's all kind of crackers and all a bit mad, but it will be on. And the play is about it's sort of set between times, but it's based on a true story about the village where I grew up in very remote rural Suffolk, where a woman tried to, in the early 90s, so sort of at the height of the epidemic, tried to convert part of her house into a place where people with AIDS could come for like end of life care. And the play is about that, but also about the response of the village, but also about a man who's kind of come to stay there. So he's sort of like a guinea pig. And it's about his experiences of coming from a very metropolitan area and being somewhere incredibly remote. And then it's also kind of about loneliness and eulogy and what those parts of yourself that you don't necessarily want to look at, but when you are on your own for a long time or confronted with those, that you sort of have to look.
It sounds absolutely fascinating. And as you say, based on a true story.
Yeah, so the kind of the backdrop of it is true. All of the characters are mostly fictionalized just because it's an interesting, it was a really interesting process. I mean, I've been thinking about, it's a story my mum told me a couple of years ago. So I sort of been ruminating on it for a while and thinking, could it be, is there a story inside it? And then I did a bit of research, and my parents don't live in the village anymore. And what's the best way to word this? I suppose it's an interesting thing of trying to talk to people about a certain part of history.
Yeah.
And also a part of history where I don't judge people for their decisions or their actions, because at that time, like, misinformation was pretty rife.
Yeah.
I think if you weren't in kind of the epicenter or in like actually in cities, like particularly in like Edinburgh, Manchester, Glasgow, and London were sort of the places that had the most developed amount of research about what was happening, and because the communities were much kind of richer and that there were lots of gay, lesbian, queer people there. And so therefore in more remote places, that information was harder to come by. You had to look for it yourself. And so for those people who weren't part of those worlds, they were sort of basing their opinions over what they were reading in the newspaper, which was often kind of like smear campaigns or highly like exploitative versions, but also like we all know about the AIDS tombstone advert and those things. And so it was a thing that kind of like it promoted fear.
Yeah.
And so in what I'm saying, I guess, of trying to talk to people about a time where they might have been ashamed of the choices or the things that they might have said, it's very difficult to kind of get people to open up or to talk about that point, because people don't want to necessarily be coloured, and actually because they might not necessarily feel that same way.
Yes.
also in a practical way, quite a lot of people were dead, like as in the village of like particularly the parish, and there weren't that many people around anymore. So it kind of gave me a real license to find something dramatic within it and to kind of use this backstory and this really rich and exciting kind of tapestry of what that village looked like. And I was there kind of at the time in the 90s. But to find characters within that who represent different things.
I think it's really interesting to look back to history and see how certain I mean, I now think it would be interesting in 30 years' time to look back on, say, COVID and see how people's reactions to that were and how those have changed over time. And, you can go back to many things. Now, you mentioned you're going to be on at the Pleasance.
That's right.
Now, the Pleasance covers a big area. And where exactly can people see you and when?
So it's at the Pleasance Dome, and then it's in the Ace space, I believe, and it's 4:00 every day.
Oh, good. Great time, yeah. And what can audiences expect?
Well, I've got it's a two-hander, so there's two brilliant actors, and Josh Seymour is directing. So hopefully, just a really good play. But I suppose what audience can expect from it, the thing that I always found the most interesting and kind of moving part of the story is that I grew up there. I grew up there at that time as a queer person, and also someone who looked out into this village and into this world and kind of couldn't recognize anyone who looked like me, anyone who sounded like me, anyone who was the same as me. And so I really kind of I left when I could, when I was old enough, I moved away. And I felt like I sort of detached that part of my life from myself, of going that's a space that I probably won't return to because there's no one like me there.
Yeah.
And I think it's something we do as queer people, but also I think of all communities, and I think anyone who might be different or appear different or feel different kind of can go, my community exists in a certain space and it doesn't exist anywhere else. And so therefore those spaces are unsafe and safe. And I think what's most remarkable and what I kind of want people to take away from it is that there was this woman trying to do a thing, she didn't necessarily know how to do it. It was all kind of in the intention of it was kind of rooted completely in kindness. And I found that as a story really surprising, because I had made such an assumption about people who were raised in a certain place or looked a certain way, that there are, if you look for the people, there are always people who want to help.
Yeah.
And they might not necessarily know how to, but that kind of I get it is hope. It's hope. And whilst the story, I think also for an audience, is quite melancholic at times, and it is deeply sad, there is also quite a lot of humor in it. And I hope also, for want of a better term, I do hope that people leave it kind of feeling some sense of hope for the next bit of what the blueprint is, but also what we're kind of paving the way for.
There's a couple of things there. I think you're right. People often leave to find their people, or leave to find, but also the bravery in someone staying in a place that was perhaps not as understanding and welcoming as they may be today is quite, moving, actually.
Yeah, and it's like an act of bravery, really. The writing of this play, but also just the act of often going back to that place is really difficult at times, because it reminds me and it takes me back to times that aren't necessarily the brightest or the happiest memories. However, what I will say is when you actually start to look deeply at it, you can go, it wasn't all completely bad.
Yeah.
There are always pockets of light and there are pockets of happiness that it's sometimes useful to revisit. It's useful to kind of look back at those times. And that is quite a lot also what the play is about this man who kind of, again, colours this community with a certain brush, but it's about where he is challenged and where he is encouraged to sort of look back on himself and his own experiences.
And is this your first play that you've written?
First play I've written.
Yeah. So was it always going to be this story, or were there other ones that you were thinking about?
No, I think probably always this. I think because it's, well, there's a thing saying, write what you know.
Yeah.
So that was helpful. And I think there's a lot of, um, not necessarily, like, I suppose I didn't have to imagine that far. Like, the world is so built because it's part of the fabric of who I am. Like, it's my upbringing and it's my culture and it's my kind of history. So that was really easy to access. And kind of having ideas of who these people are or who they are based upon actually made the writing process quite easy because I could really see these quite vivid characters. Yeah, no, well, not the thing. I mean, now I'm sort of I am writing different things. So this is a play that's in production. I've got a couple of other things kind of in the pipeline. So those are different plays, but this was always the first one.
And was it always going to be a piece of theatre? You never considered writing it as a novel, for instance, or something like that?
No, but that is so interesting. I really hadn't. I think there is something in the art of theatre, not to sound wanky, but there are lots of bits in this play, I think, that ask you to properly look.
Yeah.
And to look at sometimes parts of yourself, but also particularly in the character of kind of confronting those parts of themselves. And I think theatre is the only art form that we go to a collective audience, like, don't look at your phone, don't talk. Like, and it's a singular experience and a collective experience that I don't think, like, you don't get from telly and you don't get from novels because you can distance yourself from it. But whereas if there is an immediacy, I think there's such a magic in that and there's such an alchemy that there's nothing really else like it.
I think they are absolutely right. I think maybe increasingly so. There's so many distractions when you do other things. Here, it is a captive audience, in that sense. And also, if you read something or you're watching something which is uncomfortable or challenging, then it's very easy to just go, right, I'm going away from that. And I'm going to do here, you really have to engagement. There's that kind of I was going to say collaboration, but that's not quite the word. But you've got a relationship between audience and people on stage, which I think it needs to work both ways in that sense.
Absolutely, and I think like the key thing that Josh, who's the director, has talked a lot about is like what is the role of the audience? Like, why have they been invited into this room?
Yeah.
But also, yeah, like what purpose are they serving? Like, what is it? How are we thinking about them also as a character? Because they are engaged and they are involved because they are looking in. But yeah, like you say, there's nothing really else like it, which is magical. And I also think, which is quite useful in Edinburgh, because the play needs to be like 60, 70 minutes, that's just enough time that I think all of our attention spans have reduced. And so actually, like, a play that is an hour and a bit is usually, like, hopefully enough time to keep people engaged and locked in before they kind of start thinking about what's for dinner.
Yeah, I do think an Edinburgh hour sometimes spoils things for other theatre where you're going, oh God, I've still got another act to go of this.
I know. Well, that's the thing. If I see a play that doesn't have an interval and straight through, I'm like, great, I'm there. I'm in. But also, I can't remember, someone told me something once that if you can't say something in 90 minutes, then you don't know how to say it. You've got too many words.
You mentioned the Lairdis Prize, and this is the inaugural one, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
So can you talk a bit about the prize and what winning it means to you?
Yeah, I mean, it was like a real surprise, like a real delight. I was contacted, must have been in April, I think, to say that I'd been shortlisted. So I was shortlisted 10. And was very, like, delighted and surprised, and then maybe 2 weeks later we're told that I had won. And so the prize is you get like you get representation from Lairdis, who are also an agency who look after creatives, and then they give you a bit of money, and also they are partnered with Method and Drama, and so the play gets published.
Oh,
so
wow.
which is amazing, and kind of the most exciting part to kind of go to be able to hold the thing that you made and say, I did this and I killed a tree. So that's really, like, all of those things are completely invaluable. And I think also because I I'd just sort of really been toying with writing. Like it was an art form that I wrote at school. Like I really liked English, and then I didn't do a degree, and I didn't have really any academic background, I suppose. And I think I really had probably made the decision that I wasn't intelligent enough to be a writer, because I thought you kind of needed a qualification, or you needed a degree in writing in English, and you needed to know, like, maybe you still do because the play might be whatever, but you needed to know things about structure, and you had to read everything that Chekhov had ever written, and also all of these sort of like tick boxes. And I was like, I haven't done any of that. So I really put it off for a long time, and then because this story kind of came about, and I was like, oh, I just want to play with it and see where it could go, and really enjoyed the process of writing. What this has done, I guess, of winning has given me, it's just allowed me like a bit of confidence to kind of consider myself as a writer, and to kind of go, this is an avenue worth pursuing, but also there are stories that I'm interested in telling that I suppose people are interested in hearing as well. And so that it's affirmation, really.
Yeah.
And it's sort of quieting those voices that go, you're not smart enough.
I think many people have those, though. Yeah, it's the thing,
Yeah,
and all sorts of things. Now, it's your first play, but is it your first time in Edinburgh for the Fringe, or have you been before?
No, I've been as a punter.
Yeah.
So I've been a couple of times. I feel like when was that? I didn't go last year, I went the year before, and then I used to do quite a bit kind of pre-COVID. Definitely learned the hard way of watching like 8 shows in one day. And then the next day having one at 10 a.m. and being like, I can too many plays.
Yeah.
But it will be my first time, I guess, like bringing a show there. So I'll be up for previews and for opening. So already I'm like, when will I eat vegetables? When will I sleep? When will I drink enough water? All of the kind of like maintenance. That's my main focus.
Because you said you're doing the full run.
Yes, I'm not. I will just go. I'll be up for the beginning,
right? Of course,
and then open the show with the team, and then I'll probably go away for a bit, and then I'll come back at the end as well. Just to kind of
so
and I think also having 2 blocks, because I think the beginning might be quite stressful, and then I'd like to come up at the end and like see friends, and I've got a lot of pals who are making shows and doing shows as well. So it'd be nice to be able to like visit again as a punter rather than being like.
It'll be interesting to see if it's changed over that period of time, because people do say, oh yeah, especially with a run which is so concentrated over a short period of time, you probably never, the show will probably never have that. And it will be interesting for you, I guess, to see if the direction has changed or things have changed.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think because just the parameters of like putting a show on Edinburgh, like you don't get weeks and weeks and weeks of rehearsal like you do kind of other shows. So I think we've got 3 weeks, which is pretty generous, but still quite quick. Yeah. And so I definitely, I think the first week will sort of be, the actors will still be finding it. They'll be finding it in their voices, and they'll be finding it in that space. And so, it'll be interesting to see what the end is like, and how they've grown into it and how it will have changed.
I was going to ask you for a piece of advice for people who are maybe got an idea for a play but don't know even where to start, and I will ask you that in a moment. But you said something about when you were a punter and going, and I think for anyone who's maybe not been before, it's great advice to don't try and cram everything into the time. I remember when I first started going, before I was reviewing and anything, and I wouldn't think about the geography of Edinburgh. So I would go to one place, in George Square, and then one place up at the university, or, oh dear. And if it's a hot day, you're really struggling. Yeah.
But also the amount of times I've been like, I need to get here, and then you get there on the map, and then it's like you're on a bridge, and you're meant to be underneath it, and you're like, I don't know.
Yeah, there is something of the kind of Escher painting about certainly the old part of Edinburgh.
Yeah.
But if the question was, if someone maybe they're listening to this and they said, well, this is a great idea for a play, but I just don't know where to start. How did you go from having the idea to, it's now going to be on stage? And obviously, winning the prize was helpful, but.
Absolutely. Winning the prize is also a complete gift because they take the production side of it. I guess if you're really early in the stage of like considering writing, or considering kind of just putting like opening up your laptop and opening up a Word document, my advice would be, first of all, just do it. And write the first draft that you do will be bad. And that's the process of writing. And there will be parts of it where you'll go, and this is still something I'm learning, and with everything I write, I will go through in the course of a draft, which I might try and get something out in a week, like the skeleton of a week.
Sure.
There will be points where you go, this is the best thing that's ever been written. And then you'll think, it should be illegal for me to write words. Like the two ends of it. And you just have to accept that as the process. And people I know and pals who are also writers who are very established also still have those moments of going, I am the worst writer in the universe. So just allow that to be part of the process and don't let it put you off. The thing that I really started with as well, I started with a voice. Like I started with a central character and I said, what is it that they want? What is it that they're feeling? And what is it that they want to say? And as soon as I had that in mind, it really was easy to kind of flow through the story. But you just have to start. Yeah. And if you don't start, that idea that you've got, sadly, someone else will get it and they'll do it before you.
That's a lovely idea. Avoid the extremes and try and find some kind of mean that you're aiming towards. Jacob, just before we go, we should remind people again where and when you're on.
Yes, it's at the Pleasance Dome in the A space, 4:00 every day, and the play is called Sanctuary.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, and all the very best with the play and your time in Edinburgh.
Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you properly as well. Thank you for your time.